Margaret Thompson had been a teacher for 40 years, recognizing warning signs in troubled children. She never imagined she'd be staring at CPS's number, knowing that dialing it would mean choosing between her grandchildren's safety and her relationship with her son forever. Ashley's ultimatum was clear: $50,000, or Margaret would never see Emma and Lucas again. But Margaret had discovered the truth. Ashley owed nearly $70,000 to loan sharks, and 8-year-old Emma was already parenting 4-year-old Lucas while their mother spiraled deeper into gambling addiction. In her quiet kitchen, surrounded by family photos from happier times, Margaret faced an agonizing decision. She could stay silent and watch 2 children disappear into chaos, or make the call that would brand her as the grandmother who betrayed her own family. Some choices, she realized, required losing everything to save what mattered most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The phone rang at precisely 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in October, shattering the quiet comfort of Margaret Thompson's living room like a stone through glass. She had been grading papers. Old habits died hard, even 3 years into retirement, when Ashley's voice cut through the autumn stillness with surgical precision. "Margaret, we need to talk." No pleasantries, no inquiry about Margaret's health, or mention of the changing leaves outside. Margaret set down her red pen, noting the formal use of her first name instead of the usual Mom Thompson that Ashley had adopted after marrying David 8 years ago. "Of course, dear. Is everything all right? Are the children?" "The children are fine." Ashley's tone carried an edge that made Margaret's teaching instincts prickle. 40 years of dealing with troubled students had taught her to recognize when someone was building walls. "But there's something we need to discuss. About your visits." Margaret's eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, where framed photographs chronicled better times. Emma's gap-toothed grin from last Christmas. Lucas taking his first steps in this very living room. David and Ashley's wedding, where Ashley had promised to make Margaret feel like she was gaining a daughter, not losing a son. "I'm not sure what you mean, Ashley. I think you do." The pause stretched long enough for Margaret to hear her own heartbeat. "Your visits are disruptive. The children get excited, then upset when you leave. It's affecting their stability." Margaret's grip tightened on the cordless phone. "They're my grandchildren, Ashley. I see them twice a week. I've never—" "That needs to change." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret stood, her arthritis protesting after hours of sitting, and walked to the window overlooking Maple Street. Across the way, Ruth Kowalski was tending to her fall mums, the same ritual they'd both performed for 20 years as neighbors. Change how? No more visits, no more Sunday dinners, no more picking them up from school. Ashley's voice had taken on the tone Margaret recognized from parent-teacher conferences, the carefully modulated cadence of someone delivering an ultimatum they'd rehearsed. "Ashley, you can't be serious. Emma and Lucas need—" "What they need is stability. What they need is for the adults in their lives to make responsible decisions." Margaret's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you want to continue being part of their lives, you need to contribute to their future, their college funds, their stability." The photographs on the mantelpiece seemed to mock her now. Happy faces from a time when family meant something different, when love wasn't conditional on bank statements. "How much?" The words escaped before Margaret could stop them. $50,000. The number hit like a physical blow. Margaret sank into her husband's old recliner, the leather worn smooth by decades of evening reading sessions. $50,000. Represented nearly half of her and Robert's life savings, the nest egg they'd built through 45 years of careful budgeting and modest living. "Ashley, I don't have that kind of money readily available. My pension, the savings account, it's not—" "Figure it out. This is extortion. This is protecting my family." Ashley's voice sharpened. You have no idea what we're dealing with, Margaret. What sacrifices we're making. If you can't support Emma and Lucas's future, then maybe you don't belong in it. Margaret's teaching voice emerged, the one that had commanded respect in countless classrooms. Let me speak to David. David's working. He's always working, trying to provide for his family. Unlike some people, he doesn't have the luxury of retirement. The barb found its mark. Margaret had worked until she was 65, had saved every penny, had done everything right. But Ashley made it sound like leisure, like selfishness. When can I speak to him? When you make your decision. 50,000, Margaret. Or you're done disrupting our lives. The line went dead. Margaret sat in the sudden silence, the phone still pressed to her ear as if Ashley might return, might laugh and say it was all a terrible joke. But the dial tone droned on, as relentless as Ashley's demand. She set the phone down with trembling hands and stared at the photographs. Robert smiled back at her from their last anniversary dinner, his eyes bright with the mischief that had carried them through nearly 5 decades together. What would he say? What would he do? Don't enable, his voice echoed in her memory. How many times had he said that during David's rebellious teenage years? Love doesn't mean giving in to every demand. Sometimes love means saying no. But this wasn't about enabling. This was about Emma's laugh when Margaret read her stories, about Lucas's sticky fingers wrapped around hers during their walks to the park. This was about love with conditions attached, payment required for access to her own grandchildren's lives. Margaret reached for the phone again, dialing David's cell with muscle memory. Straight to voicemail. David, it's Mom. I need to talk to you. It's important. Call me back as soon as you can. She tried the house phone. No answer. An hour later, Margaret found herself driving the familiar route to David's neighborhood, her hands steady on the wheel despite the chaos in her chest. The modest suburban street looked the same as always, matching mailboxes, neat lawns preparing for winter, children's bikes abandoned on driveways. But David's house stood different somehow. The blinds were drawn tight against the afternoon sun, and newspapers had accumulated by the front door. Margaret parked across the street and waited, watching for signs of life. David's work truck was nowhere to be seen. She knocked anyway. Rang the doorbell. Called through the mail slot. Emma? Lucas? It's Grandma. Silence. Margaret sat on the front steps for 20 minutes, hoping to catch sight of her grandchildren, to somehow make sense of Ashley's demand. But the house remained, shuttered, unwelcoming. By the time she returned home, the sun was setting, and Ruth was waiting on her porch with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Saw you leave earlier, Ruth said, her nursing background evident in the way she assessed Margaret's expression. Figured you might need to talk when you got back. Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully, her hands still shaking slightly. Ruth had been her anchor since Robert's death 3 years ago, the kind of neighbor who appeared with casseroles during hard times and common sense during confusion. Ashley called today? Ruth's eyebrows rose. In 20 years of friendship, she'd witnessed the evolution of Margaret's relationship with her daughter-in-law, the early hope, the gradual disappointment, the recent tension that Margaret had tried to minimize. What did she want? $50,000. Ruth nearly dropped her mug. Come again? She says I can't see Emma and Lucas anymore unless I pay $50,000. She claims it's for their stability, their future. Margaret's voice cracked on the last word. Ruth set down her coffee and studied Margaret's face with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades reading between the lines of human suffering. That's not about money, Margaret. That's about control. She says David's working constantly, that my visits are disruptive. David's been working 60-hour weeks for months. I've seen his truck here at all hours. Ruth's voice carried the authority of someone who noticed everything that happened on Maple Street. But that's not your fault, And it's sure as hell not worth $50,000. Margaret stared into her coffee, seeing her own reflection distorted in the dark surface. What if she's right? What if I am being selfish? What if— Stop. Ruth's voice cut through Margaret's spiral. I've watched you with those children. I've seen the way Emma lights up when she sees your car, the way Lucas runs to your arms like you're his safe harbor. That's not disruptive, Margaret. That's love. But if I don't pay, then we figure out what's really going on. Because this isn't about college funds or stability. This is about something else entirely. Margaret nodded, though the weight in her chest remained. $50,000 or lose her grandchildren forever. The choice felt impossible. The stakes too high to calculate. But Ruth was right about one thing. This wasn't about money. This was about something darker, something that required answers Margaret didn't yet have. The October evening settled around them, and Margaret found herself staring at her neighbors' mums, their vibrant colors defiant against the approaching winter. Somewhere across town, Emma and Lucas were having dinner, doing homework, getting ready for bed, living their lives in a house that had suddenly become foreign territory. Tomorrow, Margaret decided, she would start looking for answers. Tonight, she would sit with the impossible weight of Ashley's ultimatum and try to figure out how love had become a transaction and family had become a business negotiation, with her grandchildren as collateral. The phone inside rang, sharp and demanding. Margaret and Ruth looked at each other, hope and dread warring in Margaret's expression. It could be David, finally returning her call. Or it could be Ashley, ready to negotiate terms for the sale of a grandmother's heart. The phone inside rang, twice more before falling silent. Margaret and Ruth sat in the gathering darkness, neither moving to answer it. Whatever news waited on the other end could wait a few more minutes. Margaret needed to gather herself first. Probably a telemarketer, Ruth said finally, though they both knew it wasn't. Probably. Margaret's voice carried no conviction. Ruth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Always am. Have you noticed anything different about David's family lately? Anything odd? Ruth considered this, her nurse's training evident in the methodical way she processed the question. I've noticed David's truck gone more often. Saw him loading equipment at 5:30 last Sunday morning. That's not usual. Anything else? The kids haven't been playing outside as much. Used to see Lucas on his bike every afternoon, Emma reading on the front steps. Now, Ruth shrugged. Maybe it's just the weather getting colder. But Margaret's instincts, honed through 4 decades of recognizing when children were struggling, told her it wasn't the weather. Something had shifted in her son's household, something that made a daughter-in-law demand $50,000 for access to grandchildren. Sleep eluded Margaret that night. She lay in the bed she'd shared with Robert for 45 years, staring at the ceiling and running through every interaction she'd had with Ashley over the past few months. Had there been signs? Warning signals she'd missed? By dawn, Margaret had made a decision. If Ashley wanted to play games with her grandchildren's welfare, then Margaret would arm herself with information. 40 years of dealing with troubled. Students had taught her that understanding the problem was the first step toward solving it. She began her investigation at 7:30 a.m., driving slowly past David's house on Elm Street. In the morning light, details she'd previously overlooked became glaring. 3 newspapers sat soaked on the front walkway, not just yesterday's, but the day before and the day before that. The lawn, usually David's pride and joy, had grown shaggy around the edges. Dead leaves clogged the gutters. Most telling were the blinds. Every window was shuttered tight against the morning sun, giving the house a closed, defensive appearance that struck Margaret as fundamentally wrong. This was a family home, not a fortress. She parked across the street and waited. At 8:15, the front door opened, and Emma emerged, backpack slung over her shoulder. Margaret's heart clenched at the sight of her granddaughter, 8 years old, and moving with the careful, measured steps of someone much older. Emma looked both ways twice before walking to the corner where the school bus would arrive. No Ashley, no goodbye wave from the window. Just Emma, alone on the sidewalk, checking a digital watch Margaret had never seen before. The school bus arrived at 8:22. Emma climbed aboard without looking back at the house, and Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. In all her years of teaching, she'd learned to recognize the children who carried too much responsibility too young. Emma's posture, her careful movements, her solitary morning routine, it all pointed to a child adapting to instability at home. Margaret waited until 9 before driving to Westfield Elementary, the school where she'd spent the last 15 years of her career before retirement. The familiar brick building welcomed her like an old friend, and Principal Martinez greeted her with genuine warmth. "Margaret, what brings you by? Don't tell me you're ready to come back. We could always use another veteran teacher. Just thought I'd see if you needed any volunteer help. You know how retirement is. Too much time on my hands." It wasn't entirely a lie. Margaret had genuinely missed the classroom energy, the sense of purpose that came with shaping young minds. But today, her motivation was more specific. "Actually, we could use help in the library. Mrs. Chen has been swamped with the new reading program." Margaret's pulse quickened. Mrs. Chen was Emma's teacher. An hour later, Margaret found herself sorting books in Linda Chen's classroom while the children were at recess. Linda had been one of Margaret's student teachers years ago, and their conversation flowed easily from professional updates to more personal matters. "I have to ask," Margaret said carefully, "how is my granddaughter Emma doing? David's been so busy with work lately, and I worry I'm not getting the full picture." Linda's expression shifted subtly. The same look Margaret had seen in her own mirror when discussing a struggling student with concerned parents. "Emma's going through a transition period," Linda said diplomatically. "Her academic performance has slipped a bit, and she seems more withdrawn than usual. Sometimes children react to stress at home by—" "What kind of stress?" Linda glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice. "Emma's been asking to stay after school more often. She'll find excuses. Helping clean the classroom, organizing supplies. Last week, she asked if she could eat lunch in my room instead of the cafeteria, said it was too loud." Margaret's teaching instincts sharpened. "Has she mentioned anything specific?" "Nothing concrete, but she's been very protective of her little brother. Walks him to kindergarten every morning, even though it's out of her way. Checks on him at lunch. That level of caretaking isn't typical for an 8-year-old. The pieces were forming a picture Margaret didn't like. Emma taking on adult responsibilities, avoiding social situations, seeking safety in the controlled environment of the classroom. All classic signs of a child coping with chaos at home. Has anyone from the family mentioned any changes, financial stress, job loss, anything like that?" Linda hesitated. "I probably shouldn't. But Emma's lunch account has been running low. We sent home notices 3 times, but no one responded. Emma was embarrassed when I had to give her a school lunch instead of her usual packed meal. She said her mom had been too busy to go shopping." Margaret felt something cold and hard forming in her stomach. Ashley, too busy to pack Emma's lunch or fund her account? Ashley, who had been a meticulous mother for 8 years, suddenly neglecting basic care? After leaving the school, Margaret drove through David's neighborhood with new eyes. She noted the for sale signs that had multiplied over the past month, the general air of quiet desperation that seemed to hang over the middle-class subdivision. At the corner gas station, she overheard 2 men discussing work. "Thompson's been taking every job he can get," one said. "Saw his truck at 3 different sites last weekend. Must be pulling 60, 70 hours a week." "Economy's got everyone scrambling," the other replied. "Though I heard his wife lost her job a while back. Marketing or something. Probably need the extra cash. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Ashley had lost her job. When? Why hadn't David mentioned it? The pieces were forming a clearer picture now. Financial stress, David working himself to exhaustion, Ashley home alone with increasing responsibility and decreasing resources. But that still didn't explain $50,000. That still didn't justify holding grandchildren hostage. That evening, Margaret sat at her computer, a recent purchase that Robert had insisted on before his death, and began researching. Social media profiles, professional networking sites, anything that might give her insight into Ashley's recent situation. What she found confirmed her suspicions. Ashley's LinkedIn profile showed her last position ending 8 months ago. Marketing manager at Pinnacle Solutions, January 2018, February 2024. 8 months of unemployment in a household that had grown accustomed to 2 incomes. But there were other details that bothered Margaret. Ashley's Facebook posts had become sporadic, then stopped entirely 3 months ago. Her Instagram, once filled with family photos and inspirational quotes, had gone silent around the same time. People didn't just disappear from social media without reason. In Margaret's experience, it usually meant they were hiding something from their friends, their family, or themselves. Margaret closed the laptop and walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the familiar street where she'd lived for 30 years. Ruth's house was dark except for the porch light, the mums still standing, sentinel against the approaching winter. Somewhere across town, Emma was probably helping Lucas get ready for bed while David worked late, and Ashley. What? What was Ashley doing that required $50,000 to fix? Margaret poured herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where she'd graded thousands of papers, planned countless lessons, and made decisions that affected hundreds of children's lives. Now she faced the most important case of her career, her own grandchildren's welfare. The evidence was mounting. Job loss, financial stress, David's absence, Emma's behavioral changes, Ashley's withdrawal from social connections. But Margaret needed more than circumstantial evidence. She needed to understand what had driven Ashley to such desperate measures, because demanding $50,000 wasn't just about money. It was about something darker, something that made a mother willing to weaponize her children's love for their grandmother. Margaret reached for the phone, then stopped. David still hadn't returned her call from yesterday. Either he was truly that busy, or Ashley had told him not to respond. Neither option offered much hope for a simple conversation. Tomorrow, Margaret decided, she would dig deeper. She would find out what Ashley was hiding, what had transformed a devoted mother into someone who would extort family members. Because Emma and Lucas deserved better than adults who were too busy, too tired, or too desperate to protect them. The tea had grown cold in her hands, but Margaret didn't notice. Her mind was already planning the next phase of her investigation, her maternal instincts fully engaged. 40 years of teaching had taught her that every troubled child had a story, and every story had clues. She just had to be brave enough to follow them wherever they led. The tea had grown cold in her hands, but Margaret didn't notice. Her mind was already planning the next phase of her investigation, her maternal instincts, fully engaged. She was still sitting at the kitchen table when her phone rang at 9:47 p.m., David's ringtone cutting through the silence like a blade. "Mom?" His voice sounded exhausted, older than his 32 years. "I got your message. Sorry it took so long to call back. It's been crazy at work." Margaret's pulse quickened. "David, we need to talk. Ashley called me yesterday and I know, she told me." The weariness in his voice deepened. "Look, Mom, I understand you're upset, but Ashley's just trying to protect our family. Things are tight right now, and having you involved in everything is it's complicated." "Complicated how?" "David, she's asking for $50,000 to let me see my grandchildren. How is that protecting anyone?" A long pause. In the background, Margaret could hear the sound of a television, canned laughter, from some late-night show. "The kids are fine, Mom. We're handling things. Ashley just thinks it would be better if you gave us some space for a while." "Space?" Margaret's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "I see Emma and Lucas twice a week. I pick Emma up from school sometimes. How is that not giving you space?" "I can't do this right now, Mom. I'm sorry. I really am. But Ashley knows what's best for our family." The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at the phone in disbelief. David, her David, defending Ashley's extortion as family protection. Something was very wrong, and it went deeper than financial stress or job loss. Margaret didn't sleep that night. By morning, she had made a decision. If her family wouldn't tell her the truth, she would find it herself. Her breakthrough came 3 days later, in the most mundane of places, the cereal aisle at Kroger. Margaret was reaching for her usual box of whole grain when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Margaret? Margaret Thompson?" She turned to find a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying brown hair, someone who looked vaguely familiar but whom Margaret couldn't immediately place. "I'm Jennifer Walsh. I used to work with Ashley at Pinnacle Solutions. We met at the company Christmas party a few years ago." Recognition dawned. Jennifer had been Ashley's supervisor, the woman Ashley had spoken highly of during family dinners. "Of course! How are you, Jennifer?" "I'm well, thanks. Still at Pinnacle? Though it's not the same since the layoffs." Jennifer's expression grew troubled. "I was so sorry to hear about Ashley. The whole situation was just heartbreaking." Margaret's investigative instincts sharpened. "What exactly happened? Ashley hasn't. We haven't talked much about it." Jennifer glanced around the empty aisle, then leaned closer. "She was such a good employee, you know? Reliable, creative, always met her deadlines. But the last few months before the layoffs, something changed. She started missing meetings, coming in late. Her work quality slipped." "Did you ever find out why?" "I tried talking to her, but she was secretive, defensive. She'd disappear during lunch breaks, always on her phone. At first I thought maybe she was job hunting, but—" Jennifer shook her head. "I found her in her office one day crying, not just upset, devastated. She had her laptop open, and I caught a glimpse of the screen before she slammed it shut." Margaret's chest tightened. "What did you see?" "Gambling websites, multiple tabs open, and her bank account. I only saw it for a second, but the balance was— well, let's just say it explained why she'd been asking for advances on her salary." The grocery store seemed to fade around Margaret. Gambling. Ashley had been gambling. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapped into focus with terrible clarity. When did this start? "I'm not sure exactly. Maybe 8 months before the layoffs? She'd always been careful with money. You know how she was about budgeting and planning. But something shifted during the pandemic. I think the isolation, the stress, everyone being home all the time. Some people picked up new hobbies. Ashley picked up a destructive one." Margaret thanked Jennifer and finished her shopping in a daze, her mind racing through implications. Gambling addiction explained everything: the secrecy, the financial desperation, the extortion demand. $50,000 wasn't about college funds or stability. It was about debt, about creditors, about a woman drowning in consequences she couldn't control. 2 days later, opportunity presented itself in the form of desperation. David called at 6 p.m., his voice tight with stress. "Mom, I know things have been difficult between us, but Ashley's having some kind of medical issue, and I need to take her to urgent care. Would you mind watching Emma and Lucas for a few hours?" Margaret's heart leaped even as her mind noted the crack in Ashley's carefully constructed wall. "Of course. I'll be right there." The house felt different when Margaret entered. Not just the drawn blinds and accumulated newspapers, but an underlying tension that seemed to permeate the walls. Emma greeted her with a fierce hug that lasted longer than usual, while Lucas clung to her leg with desperate affection. "Grandma, can you read to us tonight?" Emma asked, her 8-year-old voice carrying a weight that broke Margaret's heart. "Of course, sweetheart. Where's your mother?" "In her room. Daddy said she has a headache." Emma's tone carried the careful neutrality of a child who'd learned not to ask too many questions. While the children played in the living room, Margaret used Ashley's headache as an excuse to check on her. She knocked softly on the bedroom door, receiving no response, then pushed it open slightly. Ashley lay on the unmade bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Her phone was beside her, screen still lit, and Margaret caught a glimpse of numbers, flashing lights, and the unmistakable interface of an online casino game. "Ashley? How are you feeling?" Ashley jolted upright, fumbling to close the phone app. "Margaret, David said you were coming. I have a migraine. Can I get you anything? Water? Medicine?" "No, just... Could you keep the kids quiet? The noise makes it worse." Margaret nodded and backed out of the room, but not before noticing the stack of mail on Ashley's nightstand. Opened envelopes with red lettering visible, official-looking documents that Ashley had hastily tried to conceal. For the next 3 hours, Margaret played grandmother while conducting the most important investigation of her life. She helped Emma with homework and noticed the 8-year-old doing math problems far above her grade level, budgeting exercises disguised as word problems. She watched Lucas build elaborate towers with blocks, then knock them down with an aggression unusual for his typically gentle nature. "Emma," Margaret said carefully as they read together, "has Mommy been feeling sick a lot lately?" Emma's body tensed against Margaret's side. "Sometimes. She gets headaches when people call. And she cries at night sometimes, but she thinks we don't know." "What kind of people call?" "Mean people. They make Mommy upset. Daddy doesn't know. Mommy said it's private grown-up business." Margaret's heart clenched. Emma was carrying secrets, protecting her mother from her father's knowledge. The 8-year-old was managing adult information that no child should have to handle. When Ashley finally emerged to say goodbye to David, Margaret caught sight of her phone screen again, this time clearly showing a betting app with a balance of -847. But it wasn't the only app. Margaret counted at least 3 different gambling platforms in Ashley's recently used applications. After David and Ashley left for urgent care, Margaret faced an impossible decision. She could respect boundaries and wait for their return, or she could use this opportunity to understand the full scope of what her grandchildren were living with. The choice was made for her when Lucas started crying inconsolably, and Emma couldn't calm him down. "He's scared," Emma explained, tears in her own eyes. "He gets scared when Mommy and Daddy leave together. Last time, they were gone all night, and Mommy came back crying." Margaret held both children close, feeling their fear and confusion, and knew she had to act. Not as a grandmother seeking access to grandchildren, but as an adult responsible for recognizing danger. In Ashley's purse, left behind in her hurried departure, Margaret found what she was looking for. Bills from companies she'd never heard of, payday loan operations with interest rates that made her gasp, threatening letters from collection agencies, credit card statements showing cash advances totaling tens of thousands of dollars. But the most damning evidence was Ashley's tablet, left open on the kitchen counter. Multiple browser tabs showed different gambling websites, each with significant negative balances. Margaret's hands shook as she scrolled through transaction histories. Thousands of dollars lost in single sessions, desperate attempts to win back losses that only dug the hole deeper. The total debt, from what Margaret could calculate, exceeded $70,000. $70,000. No wonder Ashley had demanded $50,000 from Margaret. It wouldn't even cover her full obligations, just buy her time to dig deeper into addiction and debt. As Margaret tucked Emma and Lucas into bed that night, reading them stories and promising that Mommy and Daddy would be home soon, she felt the full weight of her discovery. This wasn't about family control or financial planning. This was about addiction, about a woman so deep in gambling debt that she'd weaponize her own children's love to find money for creditors. But it was also about two children living in the fallout of adult decisions they couldn't understand or control. Emma, trying to be the perfect daughter while managing secrets too heavy for her young shoulders. Lucas, absorbing fear and instability that manifested in clinginess and tears. When David finally returned home at 11 p.m., alone, saying Ashley was staying overnight for observation, Margaret faced him across the kitchen table where she'd once helped him with his own homework. "David, we need to talk. Really talk. About Ashley, about the children, about what's really happening in this house." His exhausted face crumpled slightly. "Mom, please, not tonight. I can't handle any more drama." "This isn't drama, son. This is your family falling apart, and you're the only one who doesn't see it." Margaret pulled out her phone, showing him the photos she'd taken of the bills, the threatening letters, the evidence of Ashley's gambling addiction. David stared at the screen, his face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and finally, devastating comprehension. "She has a problem, David. A serious problem. And Emma and Lucas are paying the price." For the first time in months, her son looked directly at her, and Margaret saw not the defensive husband protecting his wife, but the scared little boy who used to climb into her bed during thunderstorms. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. "Neither do I," Margaret admitted, "but we have to figure it out, because $50,000 won't fix this, and those children can't survive much more of living in chaos." The truth was finally out in the open, terrible and liberating at the same time. Now came the harder question. What were they going to do about it? The truth was finally out in the open, terrible and liberating at the same time. Now came the harder question. What were they going to do about it? David sat at his kitchen table, staring at the evidence on Margaret's phone screen as if he could will the numbers to change. The threatening letters, the gambling debts, the cascade of financial destruction. All of it laid bare in his own home while his children slept upstairs. $70,000, he whispered, his voice hollow. "How did I not know? How did I miss this?" Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand. "Because you were working yourself to death trying to keep your family afloat. Because Ashley's good at hiding things. Because addiction makes people very, very good at deception. The $50,000 she asked you for wouldn't even cover the full debt. It would just buy her time to lose more." David's face crumpled. "What am I supposed to do, Mom? She's my wife. Emma and Lucas's mother. I can't abandon her." "I'm not asking you to abandon her. I'm asking you to get her help." 3 days passed before Margaret worked up the courage to approach Ashley directly. She'd planned the conversation carefully, researching gambling addiction treatment options, preparing offers of financial support for therapy, choosing her words to minimize defensiveness and maximize hope. She found Ashley in the grocery store parking lot, loading bags into her car with mechanical precision. Ashley looked up as Margaret approached, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness in seconds. "Margaret, what are you doing here? I was hoping we could talk." "About the other night? About what David and I discussed." Ashley's hand stilled on a bag of groceries. "David had no right to show you my private business." "Ashley, I'm not here to judge you. I'm here because I want to help." "Help?" Ashley's laugh held no humor. "The same way you helped by snooping through my things, by violating my privacy?" Margaret took a careful breath, keeping her voice gentle. "I know you're struggling. I know the gambling has gotten out of control, but there are treatment programs, support groups. I don't have a gambling problem. Ashley's voice cut through the parking lot like a blade. I have a cash flow problem, a temporary setback that I'm handling. $70,000 isn't temporary, Ashley. And the payday loans, the collection agencies. Stop. Ashley slammed the car trunk shut. Just stop. You have no idea what you're talking about. You have no idea what I'm dealing with. Margaret pressed forward, desperate to reach something human beneath Ashley's defenses. Then tell me. Help me understand. Let me help you get treatment. I'll pay for it. The best program we can find. And I'll help with living expenses while you recover. You don't have to do this alone. For a moment, something flickered in Ashley's eyes. Hope, maybe, or desperation so deep it looked like drowning. But then her expression hardened again. Treatment for what? I told you, I don't have a problem. I have a solution. $50,000, Margaret. That's all I need to get back on track. That's not how addiction works, Ashley. The money won't fix. Don't you dare call me an addict. Ashley's voice rose, drawing stares from other shoppers. Don't you dare stand there in your perfect little retirement bubble and judge my life. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. I'm not judging you. I'm trying to save you. And my grandchildren. Your grandchildren? Ashley stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. They're not your children, Margaret. They're mine. And if you don't back off, if you don't stop interfering in my family, I will move them so far away that you'll never see them again. The threat hit Margaret like a physical blow. Ashley, please. Think about Emma and Lucas. Think about what this is doing to them. I am thinking about them. I'm thinking about their future, their stability. Everything I do is for them. Everything you do is for the next bet. Ashley's face went white, then red. Get away from me. Stay away from my family. And if you ever violate my privacy again, you'll hear from my lawyer. Ashley got in her car and drove away, leaving Margaret standing in the parking lot with the terrible certainty that she'd just made everything worse. That evening, Margaret called David, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of her confrontation with Ashley. She told me what you did, David said without preamble. How could you ambush her like that, Mom? In public? I was trying to help. By humiliating her? By cornering her in a parking lot and calling her an addict? Margaret closed her eyes. David, she owes $70,000 to loan sharks. She's threatening to take Emma and Lucas away from everyone who loves them. How is trying to get her help humiliating? Because you went behind our backs. Because you snooped through our personal information. Because you're treating her like a criminal instead of family. I'm treating her like someone who needs help. No, you're treating her like one of your problem students. But she's not. A child mom. She's my wife, and she's dealing with a temporary financial situation. Margaret felt the familiar frustration of arguing with someone determined not to see the truth. David, this isn't temporary. Gambling addiction doesn't just go away. It gets worse until someone intervenes. She's not addicted, Mom. She made some bad investment decisions, and now she's working to fix them. Investment decisions? Margaret's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. David, she's betting on slot machines and poker games. She's borrowing money from payday loan companies at 40% interest. This isn't investing. It's gambling addiction. You don't know what you're talking about. I know that Emma is doing budgeting homework in 2nd grade. I know that Lucas cries every time you and Ashley leave the house together. I know that your children are living with fear and instability while you work 80 hours a week and Ashley gambles away their future. The silence stretched long enough for Margaret to wonder if David had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold in a way she'd never heard before. Stay away from my family, Mom. I mean it. Ashley's right. You're interfering in things you don't understand. And if you keep pushing this, You're going to lose us all." The line went dead. Margaret sat in her kitchen, surrounded by the same family photos that had witnessed her earlier devastation, and felt the weight of complete isolation. David wouldn't listen. Ashley couldn't be reached. And somewhere across town, Emma and Lucas were living in the wreckage of adult decisions they couldn't understand or control. But Margaret hadn't spent 40 years dealing with troubled families without learning persistence. If direct confrontation failed, she would try indirect support. If Ashley wouldn't accept help, maybe Margaret could at least document what was happening. Create a record that might prove useful later if the situation deteriorated further. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret became a careful observer. She drove by David's house at different times, noting patterns. Ashley's car gone for hours during the day, probably at the casino, Margaret realized with sinking certainty. David's work truck leaving before dawn and returning after dark. Newspapers accumulating despite Margaret's anonymous calls to the sea. Delivery service asking them to hold delivery. She volunteered at Emma's school more frequently, creating opportunities to check on her granddaughter's welfare. What she observed broke her heart. Emma had lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on her small frame. The vibrant 8-year-old who used to chatter excitedly about her day had become quiet, watchful, careful not to say too much about home. "Grandma can't visit right now," Emma told her teacher when asked about Margaret's absence from school pickup. "Mommy says it's complicated grown-up stuff." Margaret documented everything. The dates when Emma came to school without lunch money. The times Lucas's kindergarten teacher noted he seemed particularly tired or upset. The afternoon she saw Ashley's car parked at the Riverboat Casino 40 miles away, confirming her suspicions about where Ashley spent her days. But documentation felt hollow when measured against Emma's increasingly hollow eyes and Lucas's growing clinginess during the brief moments Margaret managed to see them at school events. The breaking point came during Emma's fall concert. Margaret sat in the auditorium, watching her granddaughter sing with mechanical precision, no joy in her performance. Afterward, as families gathered for cookies and conversation, Emma spotted Margaret and ran to her with desperate affection. "Grandma, I didn't know you were coming. I wouldn't miss your concert, sweetheart. You sounded beautiful." Emma hugged her fiercely, and Margaret felt how thin she'd gotten, how tightly she held on as if Margaret might disappear. "Can you come to dinner Sunday, like we used to? I miss our Sunday dinners." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret's heart broke. "I would love that, Emma. But you'll have to ask your mommy and daddy." "I did ask. Mommy said maybe, but she always says maybe about things that won't happen." Before Margaret could respond, Ashley appeared at her elbow. "Emma, go find your father. He's looking for you." Emma reluctantly released Margaret and disappeared into the crowd. Ashley waited until she was gone before turning to Margaret with cold fury. "I told you to stay away from my family. This is a public school event. I have every right. You have no rights where my children are concerned. None." Ashley's voice carried a viciousness that made other parents turn to stare. "And if you keep showing up places, making Emma think you're going to be part of her life again, I will make sure she understands exactly why you can't be." "What does that mean?" "It means I'll tell her the truth. That her grandmother thinks her mother is a terrible person. That you're trying to break up our family. That you care more about being right than about her happiness." Margaret felt something break inside her chest. "Ashley, please, don't do this to Emma. Whatever's between us, don't make her pay for it. Then stay away. Stop interfering. Stop trying to destroy my marriage and traumatize my children with your accusations." Ashley walked away, leaving Margaret standing alone in a school auditorium full of happy families, realizing she'd just been cut off from her grandchildren with surgical precision. That night, Margaret called Ruth and broke down completely. "She's going to poison them against me," Margaret sobbed into the phone. "She's going to tell Emma and Lucas that I don't love them, that I chose to leave, and there's nothing I can do to stop her." "There has to be something," Ruth said firmly. "Some legal recourse, some—" "Based on what? I have no legal standing. Ashley and David are the parents. As long as they're not physically abusing the children, as long as they keep them fed and housed, the law won't intervene just because I think Ashley has a gambling problem." "But you have evidence. The debts, the behavior changes. Circumstantial at best. And David will back Ashley's version of events. He believes her story about temporary financial difficulties. He thinks I'm the one being unreasonable." Margaret hung up the phone and sat in her empty house, surrounded by photographs of happier times, and faced the terrible possibility that she might have lost her grandchildren forever in her attempt to save them. 2 weeks later, the situation crystallized into Margaret's worst fears. David called, his voice formal and distant. "Mom, Ashley and I have decided we need a break from family drama. We won't be doing Sunday dinners anymore, and we'd prefer if you didn't attend school events or try to contact Emma and Lucas directly." "David, please. They need stability. They need their parents to be united. And your interference is making that impossible." "My interference? David, your wife is gambling away your children's future, and you're worried about—" "My interference? Goodbye, Mom. When you're ready to respect our boundaries and treat Ashley with the dignity she deserves, we can talk about rebuilding our relationship." The line went dead, and Margaret realized that in trying to save her family, she had lost them completely. Ashley's manipulation had worked perfectly, turning David against his mother, isolating the children from their primary advocate, and creating a closed system where her addiction could flourish without external scrutiny. Margaret was now truly alone in her knowledge, watching from the outside as her grandchildren disappeared behind walls she couldn't breach. Every instinct told her Emma and Lucas were in danger, but every avenue for helping them had been systematically closed. The question now wasn't whether to intervene further. The question was whether she had any intervention left to try. The question now wasn't whether to intervene further. The question was whether she had any intervention left to try. Margaret's new reality settled into a pattern of careful observation and growing dread. 3 weeks had passed since David's ultimatum, 3 weeks of driving by Elm Street at different times, parking where she could see the house without being seen, documenting what she witnessed with the methodical precision of someone building a case she hoped she'd never have to present. The notebook sat beside her on the passenger seat, a composition book like the ones she'd used for lesson planning, now filled with dates, times, and observations that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. October 15th, 2:30 p.m. 2 men in suits knocked on front door. Ashley opened it partially, spoke through chain lock. Conversation lasted 8 minutes, voices raised. Men left business cards that Ashley immediately threw away. October 17th, 6:45 a.m. David's truck gone. Emma walked Lucas to bus stop. Emma's jacket too small. Lucas's shoes held together with tape. Both children waited alone, no adult supervision. October 19th, 11 a.m. Utility truck in driveway. Worker at electrical box. Ashley came outside arguing, showed papers. Worker continued work, power disconnected. That last entry made Margaret's stomach clench. She'd watched from Ruth's car as David came home during his lunch break, saw his shoulders slump when he realized what had happened. The power was restored by evening. Margaret had driven by to check, but the image of her son frantically making phone calls while sitting in his driveway haunted her dreams. Ruth had become her unofficial partner in surveillance, offering both her car and her medical expertise in assessing what they observed. "Those children are under stress," Ruth said. matter-of-factly as they sat parked across from Westfield Elementary, waiting for dismissal. You can see it in their posture, their interaction patterns. Emma's hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats. Lucas shows classic signs of anxiety in young children. Margaret nodded, watching Emma emerge from the building with careful steps, looking left and right before proceeding to the kindergarten pickup area. At 8 years old, her granddaughter moved like someone expecting disaster at any moment. "I feel like a stalker," Margaret murmured, "watching my own family through binoculars." "You're documenting child welfare concerns," Ruth corrected firmly. "There's a difference between stalking and protecting." But Margaret wasn't sure the distinction mattered when Emma looked up and saw her grandmother's car parked across the street. The little girl's face lit up with desperate hope for just a moment before confusion and hurt replaced the joy. Emma raised her hand in a tentative wave, then dropped it when she remembered the new rules that kept them apart. Margaret drove away, with tears streaming down her face, adding another entry to her notebook. October 22nd, 3:15 p.m. Emma recognized my car. Clear emotional distress at enforced separation. The breaking point came on a gray Thursday afternoon in late October. Margaret had taken to timing her drives past the house with Emma's return from school, wanting to ensure her granddaughter made it home safely. What she witnessed that day would replay in her nightmares for months afterward. Ashley's car was in the driveway, but the front door stood wide open. Margaret could hear raised voices from inside the house. Ashley's voice, high and desperate, and a man's voice, deep and angry. Emma and Lucas sat huddled together on the front steps, Lucas crying silently while Emma wrapped her thin arms around him. Margaret pulled over and watched in horror as Emma tried to comfort her 4-year-old brother, her small voice carrying across the autumn air. "It's okay, Lucas. Mommy's just talking to someone. Daddy will be home soon. It's okay." But it wasn't. Okay. Through the open door, Margaret caught glimpses of a large man in a leather jacket, his voice growing louder and more threatening. Ashley's responses became increasingly frantic, pleading. The children pressed closer together on the steps, Emma shielding Lucas with her body when the man's voice rose to a shout. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for her phone. This was beyond family dysfunction. This was danger. Children should not be exposed to whatever was happening inside that house. But before she could dial, the man stormed out, brushing past the children without acknowledgement, and drove away in a black SUV. Ashley appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears and mascara. She saw the children on the steps, and her expression crumpled. "Come inside," she said, her voice breaking. "Come inside now." Emma helped Lucas to his feet, and Margaret watched her 8-year-old granddaughter guide her brother into a house that had become a war zone. The door closed behind them, leaving Margaret sitting in her car, notebook forgotten, phone still, clutched in her trembling hand. That evening, Ruth found Margaret sitting at her kitchen table, staring at nothing. "I saw them," Margaret said without looking up. Emma and Lucas, sitting on the front steps while some thug threatened their mother, inside their own home. Emma was trying to protect Lucas, trying to tell him everything was okay when it obviously wasn't. Ruth sat down across from her. "Did you call someone?" "Who? Child services? Based on what? That Ashley owes money to people who make house calls? That she's gambling away her children's security? I have no proof of abuse. The children aren't being hit or starved. They're just living in chaos." Emotional abuse is still abuse, Margaret. Try explaining that to a caseworker with 100 active cases involving kids with cigarette burns and broken bones. Ruth reached across the table and took Margaret's hands. "You can't save everyone, Margaret. You taught me that yourself, remember? When I was a new nurse trying to cure every patient, fix every family. You told me that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is witness suffering we can't prevent." "Those weren't my grandchildren." "No, they weren't." Margaret pulled her hands free and walked to the window overlooking her quiet, ordered street. 2 blocks away, Emma and Lucas were probably getting ready for bed, pretending not to hear their parents' whispered arguments about money, about debts, about men in leather jackets who made house calls. "I keep thinking about Emma," Margaret said quietly. "The way she held Lucas, the way she tried to comfort him. She's 8 years old, Ruth. 8. And she's already learned that the adults in her life can't protect her, so she has to protect herself and her brother." "What are you going to do?" Margaret touched the notebook on the kitchen counter, filled with weeks of careful documentation. Dates, times, observations that painted a picture of a family in freefall. Evidence that might mean something to someone someday, if things got bad enough to matter to people with the power to intervene. "I'm going to keep watching," she said finally. "Keep documenting. And pray that David comes to his senses before something happens that can't be undone. And if he doesn't?" Margaret closed her eyes, seeing Emma's thin arms wrapped around her crying brother, seeing the fear in their faces as angry voices erupted from their home. "Then I'm going to have to decide how much family loyalty is worth when weighed against 2 children's safety." Ruth left her alone with that terrible equation, and Margaret spent the night staring at her ceiling, wrestling with questions that had no good answers. At what point did protecting family become enabling destruction? When did respect for parental rights become complicity in harm? The notebook lay open on her nightstand, tomorrow's blank page waiting for whatever new crisis she would witness and document. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the silence of her empty house, knowing that across town, Emma was probably lying awake too, listening to the sounds of her family falling apart and trying to figure out how to protect everyone she loved with the limited power of an 8-year-old girl. Some problems, Margaret was learning, couldn't be solved by good intentions or careful planning. Some problems could only be endured until they became too dangerous to ignore. She was beginning to fear they were approaching that point. Some problems, Margaret was learning, couldn't be solved by good intentions or careful planning. Some problems could only be endured until they became too dangerous to ignore. She was beginning to fear they were approaching that point. The fear became certainty on a bitter November evening when Margaret drove past Elm Street at 9:47 p.m., later than usual, but she'd been unable to sleep, unable to stop worrying about Emma and Lucas. What she saw made her pull over immediately and duck down in her seat. 3 cars were parked in David's driveway and along the street, vehicles she didn't recognize. A black SUV, a white sedan with tinted windows, and a red pickup truck that looked like it had seen better decades. Through the front windows of the house, she could see figures moving around, more people than should have been in a family home at nearly 10 o'clock on a school night. Margaret fumbled for her phone, wondering if she should call police, but before she could decide, the front door burst open. Ashley stumbled out, followed by 2 men Margaret didn't recognize. One was tall and thin with graying hair, the other shorter but built like someone who worked out for intimidation rather than health. "Told you I need more time," Ashley's voice carried across the cold air, high and desperate. "I have kids. I can't." "Time's up," the shorter man interrupted. His voice was calm, which somehow made it more frightening than shouting would have been. "You've had extensions. You've had chances. Now you pay, or we find other ways to collect." Margaret's hands shook as she reached for her notebook, but she couldn't look away from the scene unfolding in her son's driveway. Ashley was crying now, begging, her words tumbling over each other in panic. "Please, my husband doesn't know. He'll kill me if he finds out. Just give me another week. I can get money. I can get something." "From where?" the taller man asked, and Margaret caught the slight accent she couldn't place. "You already owe 3 different operations. You think any of us are stupid enough to believe you've got resources we don't know about?" "My mother-in-law," Ashley blurted out. "She has money. She's offered to help before. I just need to convince her." Margaret's blood went cold. They were talking about her. Ashley was promising her money to loan sharks, using Margaret as collateral for debts she didn't even know existed. "How much can the old lady cover?" the short man asked with professional interest. 50, maybe more. She's retired, but she has savings, investments. She loves the grandkids. She'd pay to protect them. The casual way Ashley threw her children into the equation, using Emma and Lucas as leverage to buy herself time, made Margaret physically nauseous. She was witnessing her daughter-in-law auction off her family's safety to buy another roll of the dice. 1 week, the tall man said finally. 50,000, plus the VIG that's been running. That puts you at 67.5. If you don't have it by next Friday, we start collecting in other ways. What does that mean? Ashley's voice cracked. It means your husband's got a nice truck. It means this house has equity. It means there are lots of ways to get our money that don't require your cooperation. The men walked to their cars without another word, leaving Ashley standing in her driveway, sobbing quietly in the November cold. Margaret watched her daughter-in-law stand there for nearly 10 minutes, shaking from cold or fear or both, before finally going back inside. Margaret drove home in a daze, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd witnessed. Ashley owed nearly $70,000 to people who made house calls and spoke casually about alternative collection methods. People who now had Margaret's name and knew about Emma and Lucas. But it was what happened the next morning that finally broke Margaret's resolve to stay on the sidelines. She'd positioned herself across from Westfield Elementary at 7:45 a.m., telling herself she just wanted to make sure Emma and Lucas made it to school safely after the previous night's encounter. What she saw when Emma emerged from Ashley's car made her forget all about staying hidden. Emma moved like an old woman, hunched and careful, one hand pressed against her left side. Her usually neat hair hung lank and uncombed, and when she turned to help Lucas out of the car, Margaret could see what looked like a rash spreading across her granddaughter's neck and jaw, the kind of stress-induced outbreak Margaret had seen in students facing severe family trauma. Lucas clung to Emma's hand with both of his own, his 4-year-old face streaked with tears that hadn't been wiped away. He kept looking back at Ashley's car as if expecting something terrible to happen, and when Emma gently pulled him toward the school building, he resisted, pointing back toward his mother. "Mama's sick," Margaret heard him say, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "Mama crying." Emma knelt down to Lucas's level, her 8-year-old voice taking on the forced calm of an adult trying to manage a crisis. "Mama's okay, Lucas. She's just tired. Miss Johnson will take good care of you today, and I'll meet you right here after school, okay?" "Promise." "I promise." But Emma's promise carried the weight of someone who'd learned not to trust adult promises, someone who was already taking responsibility for guarantees she shouldn't have to make. Margaret watched Emma walk her brother to the kindergarten entrance, her small hand on his back, her head swiveling constantly to check for threats. At 8 years old, her granddaughter was displaying the hypervigilance of someone living in a war zone. Ashley's car sat in the pickup lane longer than it should have, other parents having to navigate around it. Through the windshield, Margaret could see Ashley slumped over the steering wheel, her shoulders shaking. When she finally lifted her head, Margaret was shocked at her appearance. Hollow-eyed, hair matted, clothes wrinkled as if she'd slept in them. Ashley drove away erratically, taking the turn out of the school parking lot too fast, leaving Margaret with the terrible certainty that Emma and Lucas had gotten themselves ready for school, made their own breakfast, and managed their own emotional needs while their mother fell apart. That afternoon, Margaret called Ruth with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "I can't do this anymore," she said without preamble. "I can't sit here documenting their decline while Emma tries to parent herself and Lucas. I saw loan sharks at the Ubai house last night, Ruth. Men who threaten to collect debts through other methods if Ashley doesn't pay them $70,000 by next Friday." "Oh, Margaret." Ruth's voice carried the weight of shared understanding. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. I don't know what I can do. David's never home. He's working himself to death trying to keep up with bills he doesn't even know the full extent of. Ashley's having complete breakdowns. And Emma. Margaret's voice broke. Emma has stress rashes and she's walking like she's in pain, and she's taking care of Lucas like she's his mother instead of his sister. That's parentification, Ruth said quietly. It's a form of emotional abuse, even if it's not intentional. When children are forced to take on adult responsibilities because the actual adults can't function. Margaret closed her eyes. I know what it is. I've seen it in students whose parents were addicts or mentally ill. I just never thought I'd see it in my own family. What does your gut tell you, Margaret? As an educator, as someone who's mandated to report suspected abuse, what would you do if Emma and Lucas were students in your classroom instead of your grandchildren? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow because she already knew the answer. She'd made similar calls dozens of times during her teaching career, sitting in administrators' offices, making careful reports about children who showed signs of neglect or emotional trauma. She'd never hesitated when the children were other people's grandchildren. I'd call Child Protective Services, she whispered. Yes, you would. Margaret spent that night researching everything she could find about CPS procedures, parental rights, and kinship care options. She learned about emergency removal procedures, family preservation services, and the legal standards for determining when children were at risk. She made lists of everything she'd witnessed, organized her documentation chronologically, and prepared a case file as thorough as any she'd ever compiled for a struggling student. But knowing what she should do and actually doing it felt like the difference between reading about jumping off a cliff and standing at the edge. The next evening, Ruth came over with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine, though neither of them had much appetite. Talk me through it, Ruth said, settling into Margaret's kitchen chair with the familiarity of 40 years of friendship. What exactly are you afraid will happen if you call? Margaret stared at her untouched low men. David will never forgive me. Never. I'll lose him forever. And probably Emma and Lucas too, at least until they're old enough to understand why I did it. And if you don't call? Emma and Lucas continue living in chaos, being exposed to dangerous people, watching their mother self-destruct while their father works himself to death trying to fix unfixable problems. What's the worst-case scenario if you call CPS? Margaret had been torturing herself with this question for days. The children get removed from the home. David and Ashley lose custody. The family is destroyed, and it's my fault. And the worst-case scenario if you don't call? The loan sharks follow through on their threats. Ashley's gambling gets worse. The children get hurt, either physically or emotionally, in ways that can't be undone. Margaret paused, then added quietly, or Ashley hurts herself. And the children find her. Ruth reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. Which worst-case scenario can you live with? The question hung between them like a sword. Margaret already knew the answer, had known it since she watched Emma try to comfort a crying Lucas while strangers threatened their mother inside their own home. I keep thinking about Emma, Margaret said finally. The way she held Lucas on those front steps. The way she promised him everything would be okay when she had no power to make that promise true. She's 8 years old, Ruth. 8. And she's already learned that she can't count on adults to protect her. So, protect her. By destroying her family? By saving her from a family that's already destroying itself. Margaret pulled out her composition notebook, filled with weeks of careful documentation. Dates, times, observations that painted a picture no one should have to see. Evidence of a family in freefall, held together only by an 8-year-old's. Determination and a 4-year-old's blind trust. I've been documenting everything, she said, flipping through pages. The utility shutoffs, the strange men coming to the house, Ashley's erratic behavior, the children's declining appearance, and emotional state. I have enough evidence to make a compelling case that they're at risk. But once I make that call, there's no taking it back. CPS will investigate. They might remove Emma and Lucas from the home. David will know I'm the one who reported them. And everything changes forever. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "What would you want someone to do if those were your children?" Margaret closed her eyes and saw Emma's face, thin, anxious, carrying burdens no child should bear. She saw Lucas clinging to his sister because his mother was too broken to comfort him. She saw two children trapped in adult chaos they couldn't understand or escape. "I'd want someone to save them," she whispered. "Then save them." That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with her notebook open, a legal pad beside it, and the phone number for Child Protective Services written on a piece of paper in front of her. She'd researched the intake process, knew that reports could be made 24/7, understood that she could request to remain anonymous initially, though her identity would likely come out during the investigation. She thought about David as a little boy, the way he'd run to her when he was scared or hurt, the absolute trust in his eyes when she promised to keep him safe. She thought about breaking that trust irrevocably, about the look on his face when he realized his mother had called the authorities on his family. Then she thought about Emma, taking care of Lucas because the adults in her life couldn't. She thought about a 4-year-old saying, "Mama sick, Mama crying," and an 8-year-old promising her brother that everything would be okay. Margaret picked up the phone and dialed. "Child Protective Services. This is Janet. How can I help you?" Margaret took a deep breath and made the choice that would change everything. "I need to make a report about 2 children who I believe are at risk." "Can you give me the children's names and ages?" "Emma Thompson, age 8, and Lucas Thompson, age 4. Margaret's voice steadied as she shifted into the professional mode she'd used for 40 years of difficult conversations. "I have extensive documentation of concerning incidents and observations spanning the past 2 months. What is your relationship to the children?" Margaret closed her eyes and stepped off the cliff. "I'm their grandmother." For the next 45 minutes, Margaret methodically presented her case. The gambling addiction, the mounting debts, the utility shutoffs, the threatening visits from unknown men, Ashley's emotional breakdowns, David's extended absences, and most importantly, the clear signs of distress in Emma and Lucas. "The 8-year-old is displaying classic signs of parentification," Margaret explained, drawing on her educational background. "She's taken responsibility for managing her 4-year-old brother's emotional needs because the adults in the home are not consistently available or stable enough to do so." "And you've witnessed this personally?" "Multiple times. I've also documented physical signs of stress in both children: weight loss, exhaustion, anxiety behaviors, and what appears to be stress-induced skin conditions." When the call ended, Margaret sat in her quiet kitchen and felt the weight of what she'd just done. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, made a choice that would reverberate through her family for years to come. But for the first time in months, she also felt something like peace. She'd stopped being a helpless observer of her grandchildren's suffering. She'd stopped enabling a system that was failing Emma and Lucas by pretending it might fix itself. She'd chosen the children over the adults who were supposed to protect them. Now she could only wait and pray that she'd made the right choice, and that when David learned what she'd done, he might someday understand that love sometimes requires the most painful decisions of all. The phone felt heavy in her hands as she set it down, knowing that tomorrow, everything would begin to change. The phone felt heavy in her hands as she set it down, knowing that tomorrow, everything would begin to change. But Margaret had been wrong about the timing. Tomorrow had already arrived. The kitchen clock showed 5:47 a.m. when she finally gave up on sleep and padded downstairs in her robe. She'd spent the night alternating between fitful dozing and staring at the ceiling, her mind cycling through the same terrible questions. Was she doing the right thing? Was there any other way? Could she live with the consequences of acting or of not acting? Dawn was breaking over her quiet neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of gray that matched her mood. Margaret made coffee with automatic precision, then sat at her kitchen table with her composition notebook open before her. Weeks of careful documentation, dozens of observations that told the story of a family in crisis and 2 children paying the price. The CPS hotline number was written on a piece of paper beside her phone. She'd looked it up 3 times, written it down twice, as if the repetition might make the call easier to make. At 6:15, her phone rang. Ruth. I couldn't sleep either, Ruth said without preamble. How are you holding up? I keep thinking I should wait. Give David one more chance to see what's happening. Give Ashley another opportunity to get help. And how many more chances do Emma and Lucas get to be children while you're giving the adults more opportunities? The question cut straight to the heart of Margaret's dilemma. What if I'm wrong, Ruth? What if the situation isn't as bad as it looks from the outside? Then CPS will investigate and find that the children are safe, and the family will get resources to address their problems. But Margaret, Ruth's voice gentled, you're not wrong. You know you're not wrong. Margaret stared at her notebook, at the careful record of Emma's declining appearance, Lucas's increasing anxiety, Ashley's erratic behavior, and the dangerous men who now knew where her grandchildren lived. I've been a mandated reporter for 40 years, Margaret said quietly. I've made calls like this before, when I saw students showing signs of abuse or neglect. But I never thought I'd be making one about my own family. That's exactly why you have to make it, because you know what the signs look like, because you understand the difference between normal family stress and genuine danger. At 6:45, Ruth arrived with fresh bagels and more coffee, settling into Margaret's kitchen, as if preparing for a vigil. In a way, she was. Do you want me to stay while you call? Ruth asked. Margaret nodded, grateful beyond words for a friend who understood that some things were too hard to face alone. At 7:30 a.m., Margaret dialed the number. Child Protective Services. This is Sarah. How can I help you? The voice was professional but warm, and Margaret felt something in her chest loosen slightly. I need to make a report about 2 children who I believe are at risk of harm. I can take that report. Can you give me the children's names, ages, and your relationship to them? Emma Thompson, 8 years old, and Lucas Thompson, 4 years old. I'm their paternal grandmother. I see. And what are your concerns about Emma and Lucas? Margaret opened her notebook and began to speak, her teacher's training taking over. She presented the information systematically. Ashley's gambling addiction, the mounting debts, the utility shutoffs, the threatening visits from creditors, the children's declining physical and emotional condition. I've been documenting incidents for the past 2 months, Margaret explained. The children are showing clear signs of stress and neglect. Emma has developed what appears to be a stress rash. Both children have lost weight, and Emma has taken on inappropriate caregiving responsibilities for her younger brother. Sarah asked careful questions, and Margaret could hear typing on the other end of the line. You mentioned that the mother has a gambling addiction. Have you witnessed this directly? I've seen gambling applications on her phone and tablet. I've found documentation of debts to multiple payday loan companies and online betting sites. And I witnessed a confrontation at the home between Ashley and what appeared to be debt collectors, men who made specific threats about alternative collection methods if she didn't pay. Were the children present during this confrontation? Margaret's voice caught. They were sitting on the front steps. Emma was trying to comfort Lucas while these men threatened their mother inside their own home. More typing. What about the father, David Thompson? He's working excessive hours trying to manage financial problems he doesn't fully understand. He's often away from home for 12 to 14 hours a day, leaving the children primarily in Ashley's care. I don't believe he's aware of the full extent of his wife's gambling or the dangerous people she owes money to. Have you attempted to address these concerns with the parents directly? Margaret closed her eyes. Yes. Ashley became hostile and threatened to move the children away if I continued to interfere. David believes his wife's version of events and has asked me to stop contacting the family. So you're currently estranged from the family? Yes, which is why I waited so long to make this call. I kept hoping the situation would improve, that David would recognize what was happening. But it's getting worse, not better. And the children are bearing the cost. Sarah's questions continued for another 20 minutes, methodical and thorough. She asked about specific incidents, about Margaret's professional background, about whether she believed the children were in immediate physical danger. Based on what you've described, Sarah said finally, we will need to initiate an investigation. I want to be clear about what this means. A caseworker will be assigned to visit the home and interview all family members, including Emma and Lucas. The parents will be notified that a report has been made, though we can initially keep your identity confidential. Initially? If the investigation proceeds, they may learn who made the report. Are you prepared for that possibility? Margaret looked at Ruth, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, I'm prepared to take responsibility for this decision. The investigation will take time, Sarah continued. We'll assess the immediate safety of the children and determine what services or interventions might be appropriate. Our goal is always family preservation when possible, but the children's safety is our primary concern. When the call ended, Margaret sat in silence for several minutes, feeling the weight of what she'd just set in motion. How do you feel? Ruth asked gently. Terrified, Margaret admitted, and relieved, and guilty. And like I just betrayed my son while trying to save my grandchildren. Ruth reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. You did the right thing. It was a terrible choice to have to make, but you did the right thing. Margaret nodded, then pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I need to write David a letter. When he finds out I made this call, I want him to understand why. She wrote for over an hour, trying to explain the unexplainable. How love sometimes required betrayal. How protecting children sometimes meant destroying the family structure meant to protect them. She wrote about Emma's bravery and Lucas's tears, about Ashley's desperation and David's blindness, about the impossible position of watching children suffer while respecting parental rights. I know you may never forgive me for this, she wrote, near the end. I know I may have lost you forever by making this call. But I couldn't live with myself if something happened to Emma and Lucas that I might have prevented. They need advocates, David. They need adults who will put their safety above everything else, even family loyalty. I love you. I love Ashley, despite everything. And I love Emma and Lucas enough to be the villain in their story, if that's what it takes to keep them safe. As Margaret sealed the letter, she realized that the hardest part wasn't behind her. It was just beginning. The investigation, the family's reaction, the long process of whatever came next. But for the first time in months, she felt like she was fighting for her grandchildren instead of just documenting their decline. The call had been made. The die was cast. Now she could only wait and pray that when the dust settled, Emma and Lucas would be safe, even if it cost Margaret everything else she held dear. The call had been made. The die was cast. Now she could only wait and pray that when the dust settled, Emma and Lucas would be safe, even if it cost Margaret everything else she held dear. Sarah Mitchell had been a Child Protective Services caseworker for 12 years, long enough to recognize the signs of a family in crisis before she even stepped out of her car. The house on Elm Street looked ordinary enough from the outside. Typical suburban split level, small front yard, children's bicycles on the porch. But Sarah had learned to look deeper. The newspapers piled up by the front door despite it being midweek. The untrimmed hedges and unraked leaves that suggested no one had time for maintenance. The curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun, creating an atmosphere of secrecy rather than privacy. Sarah knocked on the door at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, timing her visit for after school when the entire family would likely be home. She'd reviewed Margaret Thompson's detailed report multiple times, cross-referenced it with school records and utility company complaints. The grandmother's documentation was thorough, more thorough than many professional reports Sarah had seen. The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. Ashley Thompson's eyes were red-rimmed and suspicious. "Are you Ashley Thompson?" "Yes." "Who are you?" "I'm Sarah Mitchell from Child Protective Services. I need to speak with you and your husband about your children, Emma and Lucas." The color drained from Ashley's face. "I don't understand. There must be some mistake." "May I come in? I have some questions, and it would be better if we could talk privately." Ashley's grip tightened on the doorframe. "My children are fine. There's no reason for you to be here." "Mrs. Thompson, I can explain everything once we sit down. Are Emma and Lucas home? Is your husband available?" After a moment's hesitation, Ashley stepped back and let Sarah enter. The living room told a story of its own. Children's toys scattered across the floor, but not in the joyful chaos of active play. These toys looked abandoned mid-game, as if Emma and Lucas had been interrupted and never returned. Fast food containers sat on the coffee table, and Sarah noticed several overdue bill notices stacked on an end table. "David," Ashley called, toward the back of the house. "David, you need to come here." David appeared from what Sarah assumed was his home office, still in work clothes, looking exhausted and confused. "What's going on? Ashley, who is this?" "I'm Sarah Mitchell from Child Protective Services. I'm here because we received a report expressing concern about Emma and Lucas's welfare." David's face went blank. "That's impossible. Our kids are fine. Who would make a report?" "I can't discuss the source of the report right now, but I can tell you about the concerns that were raised." Sarah settled into a chair, pulling out her tablet. "May I speak with Emma and Lucas first? It's standard procedure to check in with the children during these visits." "Our children don't need to be questioned," Ashley said sharply. "This is harassment." "Mrs. Thompson, I understand this is stressful, but cooperating with the investigation is in everyone's best interest. Emma and Lucas won't be interrogated. I just need to see how they're doing." Emma appeared at the top of the stairs as if summoned by the mention of her name. Sarah's heart clenched at the sight of the thin 8-year-old with anxious eyes and what looked like a stress rash along her jawline, exactly as Margaret Thompson had described. "Emma, sweetie, can you come down here, please?" David called, his voice artificially cheerful. Emma descended the stairs slowly, studying Sarah with the wariness of a child who'd learned to assess adult moods for danger. Lucas followed behind, his sister, staying close enough to touch her arm. "Hi, Emma." "Hi, Lucas. I'm Sarah. I work with families, and I wanted to meet you both." "Are we in trouble?" Emma asked, her 8-year-old voice carrying far too much adult concern. "No, honey. You're not in trouble at all. I just wanted to see how you're doing. Can you show me your room?" Emma looked to her parents for permission, and Sarah noted the careful way the little girl monitored adult reactions before making any moves. Lucas clung to Emma's hand as they led Sarah upstairs. The children's rooms were clean, but sparse, lacking the accumulated possessions of children whose families weren't constantly worried about money. Emma's room held a few books, some drawing supplies, and a stuffed animal that looked well loved. Lucas's room was smaller, with a toddler bed he'd clearly outgrown and toys that seemed to be handed down from his sister. "Emma, how are things?" "At home?" Sarah asked, sitting on the floor to bring herself to the children's eye level. Emma's response was carefully neutral, the kind of non-answer children gave when they'd been coached or when they were protecting family secrets. "Fine. Everything's fine." "What about school? Do you like your teacher?" This question got a more genuine response. Emma's face lit up slightly as she talked about reading groups and math games, but Sarah noticed how quickly she shifted back. "To worry? Does Mama seem sad sometimes?" Sarah asked gently. Emma's face closed off again. "Sometimes? But Daddy says grown-ups worry about grown-up things, and kids don't need to worry." "That's right. Kids shouldn't have to worry about grown-up things. Who takes care of you when Mama and Daddy are busy?" "I take care of Lucas," Emma said matter-of-factly. "I'm good at it." Sarah's heart broke a little. An 8-year-old should never have to describe herself as good at taking care of her 4-year-old brother. The interview with Lucas was shorter. He was too young to articulate complex feelings, but his body language spoke volumes. He rarely moved more than arm's length from Emma, flinched slightly at unexpected sounds, and seemed exhausted for a 4-year-old in the middle of the afternoon. When Sarah returned downstairs, she found David and Ashley in heated, whispered conversation that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I need to discuss some specific concerns that were brought to our attention." Sarah opened her tablet and began reading from Margaret's report. Ashley's gambling activities, the utility shutoffs, the threatening visits from creditors, the children's declining appearance, and Emma's inappropriate caretaking responsibilities. With each item, David's face grew paler and Ashley's grew more defensive. "That's all lies," Ashley said when Sarah finished. "Whoever told you this is trying to destroy our family." "Mrs. Thompson, are you currently gambling?" "I'm not addicted to anything. I play some online games sometimes, but everyone does that." Sarah turned to David. "Mr. Thompson, were you aware of your wife's gambling activities?" David looked at Ashley with growing comprehension and horror. "Ashley, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you haven't been gambling." The silence stretched, until Ashley finally cracked. "It's not what you think, David. I was trying to win money. To help us. To make things better." "How much?" David's voice was barely audible. "It doesn't matter now." "How much, Ashley?" "About 70,000. David sank into a chair as if he'd been physically struck. $70,000? "Ashley, where did you get $70,000 to lose?" The truth came out in pieces. The credit cards David didn't know about, the payday loans, the dangerous men who'd been visiting their home. With each revelation, David's expression shifted from disbelief to devastation to something approaching panic. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said gently, "were you aware that your children have been exposed to threatening individuals in your home?" "No," David whispered. "I work long hours. I thought Ashley was handling everything." Sarah spent another hour documenting the family's situation, making notes about the children's condition, the parents' responses, and the immediate safety concerns. Ashley alternated between defiance and breakdown, while David seemed to age years in the span of their conversation. "Here's what happens next," Sarah said finally. "I'm requiring immediate safety measures. Mrs. Thompson, you'll need to submit to drug testing within 48 hours and begin attending parenting classes. Mr. Thompson, I need documentation of your work schedule and childcare arrangements." "Are you taking our children?" Ashley asked, her voice breaking. "Not at this time, but the situation will be monitored closely. I'll be making unannounced visits, and both children will be interviewed at school. You'll also need to provide documentation of your debts and any ongoing threats to the family's safety." Sarah handed them each a card with her contact information. "This investigation is just beginning. Your cooperation will be essential in determining what services your family needs." As Sarah prepared to leave, Emma appeared at the top of the stairs again, listening to adult conversations she shouldn't have to hear. "Everything's going to be okay," Sarah called up to her, meaning it. For the first time in months, Emma and Lucas had adults whose primary job was protecting them, not managing crises or hiding secrets. Whether the family survived intact was still unclear, but Sarah was determined that the children would be safe, whatever that ultimately required. Whether the family survived intact was still unclear, but Sarah was determined that the children would be safe, whatever that ultimately required. The phone call came 3 days after Sarah's initial visit, at 7:23 p.m. on a Friday evening. Margaret was washing dishes when David's number appeared on her screen. She'd been expecting this call since making her report to CPS, dreading it with every fiber of her being while knowing it was inevitable. "Hello, David." "How could you?" His voice was barely controlled fury, each word precisely enunciated in a way that reminded Margaret of him as an angry teenager. "How could you call child services on my family? On your own grandchildren?" Margaret set down the plate she'd been washing, her hands suddenly unsteady. "David, I can explain." "Explain? You want to explain how you decided to destroy my marriage and traumatize my children? You want to explain how you went behind my back and reported us like we're criminals?" "You weren't protecting them," Margaret said quietly. "Someone had to." Protecting them from what? From their own parents? From a mother who loves them and a father who works himself to death to provide for them? From loan sharks threatening your family in your own driveway? From a mother so deep in gambling, addiction she can't take care of herself, let alone 2 children? From living in chaos while you work 80 hours a week and pretend everything is fine? The silence stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if David had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with pain. "She's in treatment now. Did you know that? Ashley's in an intensive outpatient program, going to therapy 3 times a week, attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. The woman I married is fighting for her life, and instead of supporting her, you called strangers to judge our family. I called professionals to protect Emma and Lucas. You called them because you couldn't control us anymore, because Ashley wouldn't take your money and David wouldn't side with you against his wife." The accusation hit Margaret like a physical blow, partly because she'd wondered the same thing herself during the sleepless nights after making her report. "That's not true, David. I called because Emma was trying to parent herself and Lucas, while Ashley fell apart, and you were never home to see it. I was working. I was trying to keep us afloat while dealing with problems I didn't even know existed." "Exactly. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. Because it was easier to work longer hours than to face what was happening in your own home. Don't." David's voice turned dangerous. "Don't you dare blame me for Ashley's addiction. Don't you dare suggest I wasn't trying to hold my family together." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the conversation spinning out of control. "I'm not blaming you for Ashley's addiction. I'm saying that while you were working yourself to death, Emma was taking care of Lucas because no one else was consistently able to. And your solution was to bring the state into our lives? To have strangers interview my children, threaten to take them away, put conditions on how we parent them. My solution was to get you help before something irreversible happened." "Help?" David's laugh held no humor. "You call this help? Ashley's crying herself to sleep every night because she thinks she's going to lose her children. Emma keeps asking why the nice lady had to come talk to us, wondering if she did something wrong. Lucas has nightmares. And I get to explain to my wife and children that my own mother thinks I'm such a failure as a father that she called the authorities on me." Margaret's heart broke at the image of Emma blaming herself, of Lucas having nightmares. "David, I never wanted to hurt you, or the children. But I couldn't stand by and watch. Yes, you could have. You could have trusted me to handle my own family. You could have given Ashley a chance to get help without destroying our privacy and dignity in the process. She refused help when I offered it. She threatened to move away if I interfered. And you defended her version of events even when presented, with evidence of what was really happening. Because she's my wife! Because she's the mother of my children! Because families are supposed to support each other through difficult times, not call in outside authorities the moment things get complicated. Margaret sank into a kitchen chair, feeling the weight of every choice that had brought them to this moment. I supported you for months, David. I watched Emma get thinner and more anxious. I documented Luke clinging to his sister because his mother was too broken to comfort him. I saw men threatening your family in your own driveway while your children sat on the front steps trying to comfort each other. So you decided to make it worse by traumatizing them with a CPS investigation? I decided to make sure they had advocates whose primary concern was their safety, not preserving adult relationships. The silence that followed felt final, like something breaking that couldn't be repaired. I can't forgive this, Mom, David said finally, his voice empty of anger, filled only with exhaustion. I can't forgive you for not trusting me to protect my own children, for not believing that Ashley and I could work through this as a family. David? Sarah Mitchell says the children can stay home with supervision and services. Ashley's in treatment? I'm taking family leave to be more present, and we're all going to counseling. We're going to heal from this, as a family. But you won't be part of that healing. Margaret felt something crumble inside her chest. You're cutting me out of Emma and Lucas's lives? You cut yourself out when you called strangers instead of trusting family. I was trying to protect family. No, you were trying to control family. And now you'll have to live with the consequences. The line went dead, leaving Margaret sitting in her quiet kitchen with the echoes of her son's pain and the terrible certainty that she'd saved her grandchildren by losing her son. Over the following weeks, Margaret learned about the aftermath of her report through careful observation and occasional updates from Ruth, who maintained connections with people who knew the family. Ashley was attending intensive therapy sessions and Gamblers Anonymous meetings. David had taken extended family leave and was home more consistently. The children were receiving counseling to address the trauma of living in an unstable environment. Most importantly, Emma and Lucas were safe. Margaret caught glimpses of them at school events she was careful not to attend when David might be there. Emma looked less anxious, had gained back some weight, and seemed to be playing more like a normal 8-year-old instead of a miniature adult managing family crises. Lucas appeared more secure, less clingy, more willing to separate from his sister for age-appropriate activities. The family was healing, just as David had said they would. But Margaret was not part of that healing, and might never be again. 3 months after making her report, Margaret received a single text message from David. Emma made honor roll. Lucas learned to ride his bike. Thought you should know. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. It was David recognizing that despite everything, Margaret loved Emma and Lucas enough to sacrifice her relationship with him to protect them. Margaret saved the text message and began to hope that someday, when the immediate crisis was further in the past, her son might understand that love sometimes required the most painful choices of all, and that sometimes the most loving thing a grandmother could do was be willing to become the villain in her family's story, if that's what it took to keep the children safe. The consequences of her choice would last for years, possibly forever. But Emma and Lucas were safe, and for Margaret that had to be enough. The consequences of her choice would last for years, possibly forever. But Emma and Lucas were safe, and for Margaret, that had to be enough. 6 months later, Margaret stood at her kitchen window watching Emma and Lucas play in her backyard for the first time since the investigation began. The children were there for a supervised visit, part of the family reunification plan that had emerged from months of therapy, court mandates, and careful progress monitoring. Emma looked different. The anxious tightness around her eyes had softened, and she moved with the natural energy of a 9-year-old instead of the careful precision of someone managing adult responsibilities. She was chasing Lucas around the oak tree, both children, laughing with genuine joy, a sound Margaret had feared she might never hear again. Lucas had grown taller, his face fuller, his movements more confident. He no longer clung to Emma's side constantly, though Margaret noticed he still checked periodically to make sure his sister was nearby. Some patterns of protection would take time to fade. Sarah Mitchell sat at Margaret's kitchen table, reviewing her notes from the past 6 months. The CPS caseworker had become an unexpected ally, someone who understood the complexity of Margaret's choice and the ongoing needs of the family. "How do you think they're doing?" Margaret asked, accepting the cup of coffee Sarah offered. "Much better. Emma's grades have improved significantly, and her teacher reports she's participating more in group activities instead of always watching out for other students. Lucas has stopped having nightmares, and his kindergarten teacher says he's much more engaged in learning activities." Margaret nodded, relief flooding through her. "And Ashley?" 3 months clean from gambling. She's attending GA meetings regularly, working with a financial counselor, and has been consistent with her therapy appointments. More importantly, she's learning to be present with the children instead of distracted by the compulsion to gamble. "What about David?" Sarah's expression grew more cautious. "He's making progress, took extended family leave, reorganized his work schedule to be more available. He's participating in family therapy sessions, though there's still work to be done on communication and trust issues." "Trust issues with Ashley or with me?" "Both, if I'm being honest." "But Margaret, he's beginning to understand why you made the call. It's taken time, but he's starting to see what you saw. How close." The family came to complete collapse. Through the window, Margaret watched Emma teach Lucas how to identify different types of flowers in the garden, pointing out the differences between roses and peonies with patient expertise. The sight filled Margaret with bittersweet joy. "Mrs. Thompson?" Sarah's voice brought Margaret back to the conversation. "Ashley asked if she could speak with you before she picks up the children today. Are you comfortable with that?" Margaret's heart skipped. "Yes, I think it's time." Ashley arrived at 4 p.m., looking healthier than Margaret had seen her in over a year. She'd gained back needed weight. Her hair was clean and styled, and most importantly, her eyes were clear and focused instead of carrying the desperate, shifty quality of active addiction. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with careful apologies and tentative explanations. But eventually, Ashley's facade cracked, revealing genuine remorse and understanding. "I know what I put everyone through," Ashley said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I know how close I came to losing everything that mattered. And I know that you calling CPS probably saved my children's lives." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Ashley's hand. "You were sick, Ashley. Addiction is a disease, not a moral failing." It felt like a moral failing when I was lying to David, when I was letting Emma take care of Lucas because I was too obsessed with the next bet to be their mother. When I was so desperate for money that I tried to extort it from you using their love as leverage. "But you're getting better now." Ashley nodded. "I'm trying. It's hard work, harder than I expected. But seeing Emma laugh again, seeing Lucas, trust me to be there when I promise I will be. That's worth any amount of difficulty." The children came inside as afternoon shadows lengthened, grass-stained and happy. Emma hugged Margaret with the fierce affection of a child who'd been afraid she might never see her grandmother again. "Grandma, can we plant flowers next week?" Emma asked. "You promised to teach me about your garden." "Of course, sweetheart. Would you like to choose what we plant?" "Sunflowers," Emma said immediately. "Because they always face the sun, even when it's cloudy." Margaret's eyes filled with tears at the wisdom hidden in her granddaughter's choice. A week later, David came with the children for their visit. The conversation with his son was still careful, still healing, but no longer filled with active anger. "I've been thinking about what you said," David told Margaret as they watched Emma and Lucas dig holes for sunflower seeds. "About Emma trying to parent herself and Lucas. I didn't want to see it, but you were right. She was carrying burdens no 8-year-old should have to carry. You were doing your best in an impossible situation. My best wasn't good enough. I was so focused on working harder to solve our financial problems that I missed the real crisis happening in my own home." Margaret touched his arm gently. "You're seeing it now. That's what matters." "I'm still angry about how you handled it," David said honestly. "Part of me probably always will be. But I understand why you did it. And I'm grateful that Emma and Lucas have someone who loves them enough to make the hard choices when their parents can't." It wasn't complete forgiveness, but it was a beginning. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a fresh journal, beginning to document her experience for other grandparents who might find themselves in similar situations. She wrote about the warning signs she'd missed early on, the agonizing decision to involve authorities, and the long process of healing that followed. Sometimes, she wrote, love requires us to become the villain in someone else's story in order to be the hero in another's. I lost my son's trust for months and may never fully regain it. But Emma and Lucas are safe, healthy, and learning to be children again instead of tiny adults managing adult crises. The choice to call Child Protective Services was the hardest decision of my life. It tore apart relationships, exposed family secrets, and forced everyone to confront painful truths we'd been avoiding. But it also saved 2 children from growing up in chaos, gave Ashley the external pressure she needed to seek treatment, and forced David to become the present, involved father his children deserved. I don't regret my choice, though I grieve. It's necessity. Sometimes families have to break apart in order to heal. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable dysfunction, even when that refusal causes immediate pain. To other grandparents facing similar situations, trust your instincts, document what you observe, seek professional guidance, and remember that protecting children sometimes requires sacrificing adult comfort. It's not about perfect families or perfect solutions. It's about ensuring that children have adults willing to advocate for their safety above all else. Through her window, Margaret could see the small mounds of soil where she and Emma had planted sunflower seeds that afternoon. In a few weeks, green shoots would push through the earth, reaching toward the light. By summer, tall flowers would stand in her garden, their faces turned toward the sun even on cloudy days. Growth from difficult soil. Hope emerging from hard choices. Love manifesting in ways that weren't always comfortable but were always necessary. Margaret closed the journal and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of carefully rebuilding relationships, monitoring progress, and nurturing the fragile healing happening within her family. The work would continue, for months, maybe years. Some relationships might never fully recover. But Emma and Lucas were safe, and for Margaret, that made every sacrifice worthwhile. The sunflowers would bloom soon, facing the light with the persistent optimism of living things determined to grow despite difficult circumstances. Like her family, they would find their way toward hope, one day at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.